Welcome everyone to part two on cyber threats and geopolitics with our guest, Dmitry Alpeltrovich.
And the attacks are actually quite different. Obviously, in the case of SolarWinds, they broke into SolarWinds. They backdoored an update to SolarWinds that was distributed to customers and ultimately enabled them to get into those networks. Here, superficially, you have something similar, but technically, obviously, something that's very different, where they're able to actually use password spraying attacks to break into Microsoft and some other companies as well, and really look through emails that they can get access to for credentials that could be used to break into other companies as sort of follow-on attacks. So in principle, it's sort of the same activity, that the target you're going after may not necessarily be the primary target, but simply an access point into future networks that you really, really want. But it's done obviously very differently, one through the supply chain compromise of a piece of software through a backdoor, and in this case, just looking and collecting and harvesting credentials from emails that you may be able to access through password spray operation. And the goal of SVR, though, is espionage. So both in SolarWinds and likely here, they're collecting data. They're using it to inform their reports that go up to the leadership of the SVR and likely the Kremlin, if it's important enough. And they're not necessarily in business of disruption like we see from the GRU. They don't have that typically active measures mandate that you would see from the military side.
Got it. So essentially, they're trying to collect some information and get access to more high-value targets that they're going after, or something that would present strategic advantages to Russians.
Correct. I mean, in that regard, they're really no different from other intelligence services, including our own. The goal is to collect intelligence that is vital for our national security. Now, one of the things that SVR does do that we don't do is engage in economic espionage, where they break into companies, they steal intellectual property, they pass it to their domestic industry. That is something that is off limits by policy in the U.S.
Got it. Got it. All right. Here's a really interesting question for you. So I'm sure everyone knows that the war is going on between Russia and Ukraine. So in December of 2021, you predicted that Putin will attack Ukraine. How did you come up to that conclusion, and what made you think that you were spot on that in winter the war is going to break out? And sure enough, it did happen in February.
Yeah, I said this in December of 2021, about 3 months before the war actually began, that I was convinced that he would launch this brutal invasion before the end of that winter. Unfortunately, I was proven right. But I was looking at both, obviously, the tactical data that was coming out, it's following very closely the open source intelligence about the military buildups, the moving of troops and equipment to the Ukraine border, surrounding it from multiple sides in Belarus and the east of Ukraine, in the western part of Ukraine and Crimea, and we obviously saw the impact of that when they invaded basically from four different sides in February of 2022. But beyond that, I was also getting increasingly uncomfortable in the preceding months and really years by Putin's rhetoric, watching carefully his writings, his speeches, and becoming convinced that he was looking very, very differently at Ukraine. And really, it began, I think, in 2004 with the Orange Revolution. The first time there was sort of a popular uprising in Ukraine to overturn a corrupt, what people viewed as a corrupt and rigged election, and then continued in obviously the Maidan that began in 2013 and escalated in 2014, that triggered Putin to annex Crimea and invade Ukraine. When I say triggered, really gave him an opportunity to do so. And the reason I got so convinced, and those same factors caused me to write this book, World on the Brink, because I'm getting convinced that China may move on Taiwan in the coming decade. and not eminently. So this is not happening this spring or this year, almost certainly, but potentially as soon as 2028, just 4 years away. And what convinced me is really five reasons why he was intent on doing this and why she wants to do it. And the same reasons play out in both regions. The first one is history and really the distorted view of history that both men have. Putin not believing that Ukraine is a real country, that thinks it's always been part of Russia, not really true. And she believing that Taiwan belongs to China, never been its own independent region. Also not true, as I write in the book. The history of Taiwan is fascinating. Most people don't realize that there's never actually been a single day in history when whoever fully controlled the mainland of China also fully controlled Taiwan. Not once. But there were partial controls of both mainland and Taiwan, but never full. And the second one is destiny, that they view that it is their destiny and their country's destiny to expand their empires. Putin famously wants to be the next Peter the Great, to expand what he sees as traditional Russian lands, to reverse the contraction that Soviet Union suffered, obviously after its collapse, and resurrect at least some of the lands. I don't think he wants necessarily or is focused on all of the republics, but certainly some like Ukraine that he views as the most important, and Belarus to some extent as well, as at least, if not being fully annexed, to being effectively controlled by Russia. China, same thing. She sees it as its destiny to control Taiwan, part of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, as he calls it. That is really, really important to him. The third and fourth reasons are really interrelated, and they have to do with security and geography. And we often actually, I think, underestimate how much our enemies tend to act out in various nefarious ways, not because they're just evil and that's what they do, but because there's actually reason to it that is driven by fundamental insecurities. And when Putin and many Russians look at Ukraine, they've traditionally seen a buffer state that helped to protect them against invasions from Europe. And Russia has suffered numerous invasions from Europe, from Hitler to Napoleon and Teutonic Knights. And a lot of them have gone through either Belarus or Ukraine to reach Moscow. And the distances from the eastern borders of Ukraine to Moscow are not significant. In fact, we saw that just last summer when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, decided to mutiny against Putin and took his troops out of the training camps in eastern Ukraine, occupied eastern Ukraine, and marched on Moscow and was within reach of Moscow really with a half-day march, right? So it's very clear to everyone in Russia that if NATO, for example, troops, as they're obsessed about, might one day end up in Ukraine, that NATO would be really just very, very close to Moscow. And uh, the same geography applies in Taiwan as well, because when China looks out at the world, it sees itself completely contained by the US and its allies in the region, from its western side, where it's facing US troops on the Korean Peninsula in South Korea, further down to the Japanese islands, where we have Marines in Okinawa and other parts of the Japanese island chain, down into Taiwan, where we have limited troops, mostly as trainers on the island, but really is seen as an American outpost by Beijing, and onward to the Philippines, where we once again have American troops going into Luzon to set up bases there and reinvigorating the American-Filipino alliance. So China feels very insecure when it looks out, and for similar reasons to Russia, feels like it needs to take Taiwan to break out of this containment, and Russia feels like it needs to dominate Ukraine to prevent the West from dominating it. Of course, that is illegal, both under international law, immoral. You don't, just because you think that someone might be used as a platform to invade you. Well, A, NATO has no interest in invading them, but B, that doesn't give you the right to invade them in return and try to annex their territory. But that's how they view things. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is ego. That you have these authoritarian leaders in both countries that are surrounded by yes men that uh, have a situation where it's their decision alone to launch a conflict, right? There's no one that could have told Putin inside their system that this is a terrible idea that he would have listened to. And you have the same situation now play out in China, where one man, Xi Jinping, will decide if and when they would launch this invasion of Taiwan. So that was really, I raised the alarm bells in December of 2021 publicly, warning about this invasion. Unfortunately, by that point, it was really too late to do anything about it and to deter it. And we're seeing this terrible conflict play out in Europe. But it's not too late to stop a coming conflict, a likely coming conflict in Asia that would be even more devastating than what we're seeing in Ukraine. And that was the reason for why I wrote this book.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you, Dmitry, for that. So, since we already pivoted somewhat in Middle East and Asia, so let's talk a little bit about what is going on right now in Middle East conflict. There are a lot of cybersecurity companies operating out of Israel, and they've been impacted with what is happening. And now Iran is getting involved, and Syria, Lebanon, Qatar, Houthis, they helping to exacerbate the conflict. So, how do you see this, and what companies need to watch out? What is going to come out of it? I'm pretty sure it's going to sooner or later. Well, we see a lot of all those social warrior activists on internet that posting all those different things. But before it happens, what do you see the next progression, and what organizations need to look for to make sure they're prepared for this next wave of, I'm pretty sure it's going to spill out in the cyberspace at some point, and as tensions rise in this area.
Yeah, so these days, every conflict has a cyber dimension. I think it's important not to overstate it. I'm not a believer in cyber wars. I think they're real wars, and cyber is an element of them. And certainly, you're seeing this play out in the Middle East today, where both Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran certainly have significant cyber capabilities that they've used for reconnaissance and helping plan their terror attacks, helping do battle damage assessment of their missiles that they're firing. One of the biggest threats that Israel has faced in recent 6 months or so is these cameras that often made in China that have default passwords on them that can be hacked and used for intelligence collection on sensitive sites, or just looking at damage that could be caused by rockets and the like. So they've been very actively trying to shut down and secure that infrastructure. But the cyber is now completely linked to regular traditional conflict. And you're absolutely right that there's a lot of security companies, cybersecurity companies in Israel. Some really great ones that I've had the opportunity to invest in, that are really doing amazing work. And there is, of course, a real impact to many of these companies, because Israel is a very small country. It has a small regular army. So when it mobilizes for a major war, like the one it's waging in Gaza, for example, or one it could wage with Hezbollah in the north, if those hostilities break out, it needs to mobilize reservists. And a lot of those reservists are working inside companies, both cybersecurity companies and really across the entire economy. And that's why Israel has traditionally preferred to fight very, very short wars, so that you don't have a devastating economic impact from having to mobilize a lot of your workforce and having them be unproductive. So the ramifications here are quite significant.
And yeah, it's definitely, I keep following all those conflicts, and things are not getting. So, since we're in Asia right now, and you actually wrote the book, I'd like to talk a little bit about your book. So, World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 20th century, 21st century. So, it's gonna come out on April 1st. I already put my order. Everyone else also can put it order, and I'm pretty sure it's gonna
Thank
be
you. And
fascinating.
make sure to also review it, particularly if you like it, on Amazon and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Dmitry, can you already touched upon some of it? What led you to venture into that space and to write the book about it? So, coming out of what you wrote in the book, what is your summary, or what is your perspectives of can we do better? Can we sort of diffuse certain things, certain tensions that happening in the region, and to make the world a better place, or we should expect certain things is going to happen in a very ugly way in the future?
Well, the book is actually very optimistic. It is a warning, and I hope that we um, take take the advantage of the time that we have. We didn't really have much time to stop Putin from invading Ukraine. It was really a few months before we got certainty that this war was coming, and by that point, it was really too late. I was talking to senior government officials at the time, as I write in the book, about ideas for how to deter it, and there really wasn't much that we could have done. With China, we have time. I think we have at least 4 years, could be as many as 8 years before they launch their invasion. I think 2028 through 2032 is going to be that really, really dangerous period, potentially the last period of Xi Jinping's rule. He's going to get almost certainly reelected by the Chinese Communist Party in 27 for a 5-year term, which is going to end in 2032. So he may very well, because I think he wants to do this on his own watch, he may very well decide to do that during that last term. And um, as I write in the book, we have all the advantages. First of all, Taiwan is really critical to U.S. national security interests, and I write in the book why. A lot of people have this very reductionist and simplistic, and frankly, I think insulting view that Taiwan only matters to us because they produce a lot of chips, and they certainly do. They produce over 60% of the world's chips, 90% of the world's advanced chips, on which our entire economy runs, and that's important. But Taiwan mattered to us long before the age of computing, long before chips were even a thing. In fact, in 1950, General Douglas MacArthur called Formosa, as Taiwan was called at the time, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It has always been very, very strategic to U.S. interest. It has been strategic to prevent China from dominating the Indo-Pacific, dominating Asia, the most important region in the world, in my view, where you have 50% of the world's GDP, much of the economic growth, most of the world's supply chains, and preventing China from achieving hegemony in that area, I think is vital to U.S. interests and vital for keeping the peace. And Taiwan is the linch point of that strategy. Uh, and we have time, but we don't have a lot of time to waste here, and we have a lot of strengths. Taiwan is an incredibly complicated place to invade. I actually start out the book with a very detailed scenario that I think is very realistic. I spent a lot of time working on this, being in Taiwan, talking to people there, but more importantly, walking the terrain to get an appreciation of how you would actually pull this off, invade this island of 23 million people that is a natural fortress in terms of its natural defenses. The mountains, the rivers are there, the very rough waters that surround it, tunnels, bridges, just really, really complicated place from a perspective of launching an invasion. And the scenario lays out what I think is one of the more plausible and likely ways in which China would go at it. That I think is very interesting. I was recently having dinner with a very good friend of mine that I deeply respect, General David Petraeus, former head of
Thanks for joining
CENTCOM
us.
and
For more
responsible for the
information about
surge in
these
Iraq
topics or
and
IS
director of the
squared, please
CIA
go
as
to
well. And he'd read the book. He was very gracious to give
www.issquaredinc.com.
me a praise blurb for the book. And he said, Dimitri, that is a devilishly clever scenario that you've outlined here. But the book really looks at the entire grand strategy of not just how do we deter Taiwan, which I think is fundamental to keeping the peace, because a war with China would be just absolutely devastating to the global economy, not to mention loss of lives and infrastructure, and the real risk that you're talking about a war between two nuclear powers, the United States and China, that may not stay conventional, right? We've never had this experience of fighting another nuclear power like this. And you had a very short period in 1999 when you had a conflict between Pakistan and India when they were both nuclear armed states that we were able to quickly put out. But a large conflict like this, God knows where it leads, and certainly both countries have enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other and really destroy civilization. So very, very dangerous time. But it also looks at sort of the broader issues of this Cold War with China that we're in. How do we win it on the technological arena, in cyber, in trade, in diplomacy, in in the military terms as well. So it is an attempt to craft that comprehensive strategy.
That's great. So everyone is optimistic, myself included. So nobody really wants to have another war in this particular region. Plus, China has.
Yeah,
And it,
I tell
it
you,
can be.
Nikolai. I spent time in Ukraine since this war began, and it's so devastating to visit Ukraine, to see the casualties that are coming in every single day. One of the most impactful sites there was when I was in Kiev and was actually leaving the country, getting on a train in the train station, and the entire train station was just all of a sudden flooded, absolutely flooded by ambulances, just never ending row after row of ambulances. They were picking up the daily wounded from the front, right? Just that's just the wounded. And you really feel the impact that this war is having there. You see lots of young men walking the streets of Kiev with missing limbs, and actually not that many young men and men in general, a lot of women. So war is just absolutely terrible, and we should try to avoid war as much as we can. Some wars, unfortunately, we can't avoid, but this one would have such devastating consequences, a potential war with China, that we have to deter at all costs, and that is absolutely essential to the strategy.
Yes, definitely, Dmitry. I'm with you on this one. Wars are terrible. So we're coming up to the closure of our show, and I usually ask my guests to share the favorite joke. I know you have a lot of them, so anyone you like to share with the audience would be great.
Oh gosh, I didn't prepare for this, but I'll tell you a Putin joke. This is a pre-war joke, so a lot of Putin jokes are not very funny these days. But try to put yourself in that pre-war mindset. You have a situation where Putin goes in front of the United Nations and tries to rally the world for a cause that's really important to him, which is ending time zones across the world. And he says, this is really, really important to me because Russia, of course, is such a huge country. It spans 11 time zones. And this is a real problem for us because, by the time people in Vladivostok go to bed in the Far East, we're just waking up in Moscow, and it's really, really hard to keep the whole country sort of cohesive and operating effectively when you have so many time zones. And people are pushing back on him and saying, well, if this is a problem for Russia, you don't need the world to do anything about it. You can just get rid of time zones inside Russia. Why are you bringing this to this international forum? And he's saying, well, this is not just a Russian problem. In fact, this is impacting me personally. The other day I had a phone call with President Xi, my good friend. I was calling him to wish him a happy birthday. And they told me that he's already gone to bed, that I missed it. And it was so embarrassing to me because I'm so close with him. But even worse, a few years ago, you had this terrible tragedy of the plane full of Polish leaders and the Polish president flying to Russia, and a crash landed in Russia, and everyone perished. And I was calling them was calling Warsaw to express my deep condolences on this tragedy, and they told me the plane hadn't taken off yet.
Sounds great. All right, Dmitry, I think we're at the top of our hour. Definitely, thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts. It's been really exciting and very deep knowledge, and you definitely have great of expertise in that area. Now I can clearly see why you're so excited by switching from cyber into geopolitics and spend a lot of time. Yeah, it's a fascinating area, and studying all those things. Certainly, looking forward reading your book and see what you put in there and leaving my reviews.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Nikolai. It's all very deeply interconnected. You can't be in silos these days, regardless of the area you work on. It could be cyber, it could be AI, it could be any really area of technology, semiconductors. As the saying goes, you may not be interested in geopolitics, but geopolitics is interested in you. And everyone should care about these issues because it is impacting their daily life, whether they like it or not. And I hope people check out the book, World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this exciting topic of cyber threats and geopolitics with Dmitry Alpertovich. Remember, we're stronger together, and this is all about sharing and caring. Please leave your comments at cybertalk at isquaredinc.com. And until next time, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about these topics or IS Squared, please go to www.issquaredinc.com.